the fall of 1979, a man drove home to Long Island from Brooklyn through the same expressway traffic that every commuter in the city endured, pulling into the driveway of a custom-built waterfront house in the Bar Harbor section of Massapequa Park. The neighbors knew him as a businessman. He told them he worked in construction, food retailing, the used car trade. He coached youth sports. He was home for dinner. He was, on the surface, the specific kind of working-class Italian-American success story that Brooklyn had always been capable of producing, the man from the neighborhood who had made it out and built something solid on Long Island. What he had built, and what he drove home from in the evenings, was the most prolific and methodical killing operation in the history of American organized crime. His name was Roy DeMeo. The organization he served was the Gambino crime family. The operation he ran from a Canarsie bar on Flatlands Avenue had, by the FBI's most conservative estimate, produced somewhere between 75 and 200 murders over less than a decade. Most of those people had simply ceased to exist. Their bodies had been processed through a method DeMeo had engineered, with the same attention to logistics he brought to stealing luxury cars and shipping them to Kuwait, and disposed of so thoroughly that no remains were ever located. The landfill in East Brooklyn, where the majority ended up, was eventually capped over and converted to parkland. Evidence of what happened there was not going to be found. Behind all of that was a man who had spent the morning at his daughter's school and was planning to attend her birthday party. The gap between those two realities was the gap that Roy DeMeo had decided to live in, and for most of his career, no one outside a very small circle of people in Canarsie had any idea how wide that gap actually was. The story of how he got there, what he built, and what the family that employed him eventually decided to do about it is one of the most thoroughly documented accounts of industrial-scale violence in the history of American organized crime, and it ends with a particular kind of irony in the trunk of a car. Drop your location in the comments below. It is one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this sent straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Long Island, and the man who spent his evenings at the waterfront house before driving back to Brooklyn to run what no one on the expressway could have imagined. The house on Whitewood Drive in the Bar Harbor section of Massapequa Park was everything a man from Flatlands, Brooklyn could want from a life that had gone right. It sat on the waterfront. It had been custom built. It was the kind of address that communicated, without any further explanation, that the man who lived there had made something of himself in a city where making something of yourself was the whole point. DeMeo's neighbors saw what the address was designed to communicate. They saw a husband and a father, a man who described his professional life in the ordinary terms of someone who had found his footing in legitimate business, and who was present at the family table in a way that suburban Long Island expected of its residents. 45 minutes away, in a bar on Flatlands Avenue in Canarsie that DeMeo owned and operated under the name the Gemini Lounge, the picture was different. The back of the building contained an apartment that DeMeo had installed his cousin in as a security measure to prevent law enforcement from entering and planting listening devices when the lounge was unoccupied. Inside the lounge itself, a storeroom held an arsenal that included machine guns, automatic rifles, and silencers. The men who gathered there regularly were among the most dangerous collection of individuals the Gambino crime family had ever assembled in a single crew, and the purpose they served was not incidental to what the family was or what it needed. They were, by the late 1970s, the family's most reliable instrument for making problems disappear permanently. What the crew was generating financially was of a scale that explained why the family had decided to tolerate it for as long as it did. The car theft operation alone, at its peak, was bringing in approximately $150,000 a week, an amount that translated to $7 or $8 million annually, and that flowed upward through the hierarchy in the form of tribute payments that Nino Gaggi, DeMeo's sponsor and capo, distributed further up the chain. Beyond the cars, the crew dealt in drugs despite a formal prohibition from the family's boss, ran a pornography distribution network, hijacked trucks arriving at Kennedy Airport, and had established a loan sharking operation that extended across the borough and into adjacent criminal markets. One crew member was later identified by the journalist who first documented the operation comprehensively as the chief supplier of cocaine to Studio 54 during the club's peak years. Against all of that, the FBI's conservative count of 70 murders attributed to the crew tells only part of the story. The higher estimates, reaching toward 200, are impossible to verify precisely because the method the crew used made verification impossible. Most of the people the DeMeo crew killed simply ceased to exist in any documentable sense. The FBI's own investigators, during an early 1980s effort to find remains, considered excavating sections of the Fountain Avenue landfill in East Brooklyn and concluded that the volume of daily garbage being deposited there made any meaningful search futile. The men who designed that outcome knew what they were doing. The tension that would eventually destroy the operation was already present at its height. Paul Castellano, the Gambino family boss who had finally agreed to formally induct DeMeo into the family in 1977, had done so reluctantly and had attached conditions that DeMeo ignored from the beginning. The two men occupied entirely different worlds within the same organization. Castellanos' preferred model of criminal enterprise was white-collar, financially sophisticated, and as insulated from street-level violence as the organization's structure allowed. DeMeo's model was the opposite of all of those things. What kept the arrangement in place for as long as it lasted was the money DeMeo generated. What eventually ended, it was the recognition that the money was no longer worth what the arrangement cost. Flatlands in the 1940s was a working-class neighborhood organized around the specific logic of the Brooklyn street, where the directions a young man's life might take were determined less by formal institutions than by the quality of the opportunities available on a particular block in a particular borough at a particular moment. Roy Albert DeMeo was born into that neighborhood on September 7th, 1940, the fourth of 5 children of Antonio Joseph DeMeo, a laundry company delivery man, and Eleanor DeMeo, a housewife. The family traced its roots to Formia, a coastal town in the Lazio region of Italy, and had brought with it to Brooklyn the specific blend of insularity and ambition that characterized the Italian-American neighborhoods of that era. The earliest defining loss of DeMeo's life came before he was 12 years old. His older brother, Anthony Frank DeMeo, known to the family as Chubby, was a corporal in the United States Marine Corps who was killed in action during the Korean War on April the 23rd, 1951, at the age of 20. The second defining loss came 9 years later, when DeMeo's father died of a heart attack on December 12th, 1960. His mother, faced with raising the remaining children without her husband, returned to Italy with DeMeo's youngest brother to live near Naples. Roy DeMeo was 20 years old when his father died and his family dissolved around him. Between the ages of 15 and 22, DeMeo had worked at a local grocery store and trained as an apprentice butcher, learning through daily practice how to use a knife on animal tissue with precision and efficiency. The skill was vocational and unremarkable in the context of the grocery trade. Its application would later be something else entirely. He graduated from James Madison High School in 1959, a class that included, in an irony that the historical record preserves without commentary, both the economist Walter Block and the future presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. By the time he crossed the stage at graduation, DeMeo was already earning money from loan sharking. He had turned what should have been a starting point for an ordinary life into a foundation for something considerably more complicated. He married Gladys Rosamond Britton in 1960 and began building the family on Long Island that would eventually occupy the Massapequa Park House. The marriage produced 3 children. The same year his father died, DeMeo was already operating a loan sharking book that extended through the neighborhoods where his customers lived and worked. What he was looking for was not a way out of the life his neighborhood offered. He was looking for a better way in. The Lucchese crime family's Brooklyn faction controlled the towing companies, junkyards, and car theft operations that ran through Flatlands and Canarsie, and DeMeo had attached himself to that operation as a Lucchese associate in his early years as a criminal. The relationship worked for a time. It was not the relationship that changed his career. The relationship that changed his career was the one that began in 1966. The man who would change the direction of DeMeo's career was watching him the way ambitious men in that world always watched, measuring what someone was willing to do against what they were capable of earning. Anthony Nino Gaggi was a Gambino family soldier who had observed DeMeo's operation in Flatlands and Canarsie and identified in it something the Gambino structure could use. In 1966, Gaggi approached DeMeo with a straightforward offer. He could make more money with the Gambinos than he was making with the Lucchese's, and Gaggi was prepared to sponsor the transition. DeMeo accepted. The decision meant leaving behind the organizational structure he had been working within since his early criminal years and committing himself to a new hierarchy, new obligations, and a new sponsor. What he brought with him from the Lucchese world was the foundation of what would become his crew's most profitable enterprise, car theft. What Gaggi offered in return was access, protection, and eventually an official, standing in the most powerful of the 5 New York families. The first member of DeMeo's new crew was not a seasoned criminal. He was a 16-year-old boy named Harvey Chris Rosenberg, whom DeMeo encountered in 1966 at a Canarsie gas station where Rosenberg was dealing cannabis to the neighborhood's foot traffic. DeMeo saw something recognizable in the younger man. Ambition shaped by a neighborhood that had no formal channels for it, and a willingness to do whatever the situation required. He loaned Rosenberg money to expand his operation, positioning himself as the older partner with access to larger sums, and the relationship that followed would define both of them for the rest of their lives. By 1972, Rosenberg had brought his friends into the organization. Joseph Testa, his brother Patrick Testa, and Anthony Center arrived together, a unit whose childhood bond would later be documented in court records and news accounts as the organizing principle of the crew's most violent work. Testa and Center, inseparable since boyhood, would become known as the Gemini twins. DeMeo's own cousin, Joseph Guglielmo, joined as well, acquiring in the process the nickname Dracula that the crew used for him and that never fully explained itself in the historical record. Henry Borelli followed. The brothers Richard and Frederick Dynome came into the orbit as the decade continued. In 1972, DeMeo joined a Brooklyn credit union and moved quickly into a position on the board of directors. The position was not decorative. He used it to launder money earned through his illegal enterprises, to launder the drug money of dealers he had acquired as loan sharking customers, and to steal from the credit union's own reserves to fund the loan sharking book. By the end of 1975, the combined effect of this plundering had driven the credit union to insolvency. DeMeo departed before a formal indictment could arrive and reached a settlement with the Internal Revenue Service investigators, who followed by presenting false affidavits from business owners who claimed he was employed by them. The settlement concluded the matter for the government. The technique of using false documentation to manage institutional scrutiny was not one DeMeo would forget. In the world DeMeo had built, a betrayal did not produce a confrontation. It produced a calculation. In late 1974, a conflict had been developing between the DeMeo crew and Andre Katz, a young auto repair shop owner who was DeMeo's partner in the stolen car ring and who had concluded, under pressure from law enforcement, that cooperation was preferable to prosecution. In January 1975, Katz visited the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and provided investigators with information about Chris Rosenberg's involvement in car theft. DeMeo knew about the visit before the day was over. He had an auto crimes detective from the New York City Police Department on his payroll, and the detective contacted him with the news immediately after Katz left the office. What followed was methodical rather than impulsive. DeMeo arranged for a female acquaintance named Babette Judith Questel to contact Katz and invite him to her apartment. In May of 1975, Katz appeared before a Brooklyn grand jury and provided additional information about the crew's activities. On June 13, 1975, Katz arrived at Questel's apartment expecting what the invitation had suggested and was immediately abducted by the men who had been waiting inside. He was taken to the meat department of a supermarket in Rockaway Beach, Queens. The choice of location was deliberate. DeMeo had trained as a butcher's apprentice for 7 years. What happened in the meat department of that supermarket reflected both the setting and the training. Katz was stabbed multiple times with a butcher knife and decapitated. His head was put through a machine designed for compacting cardboard. The body parts were wrapped in plastic bags and deposited in the supermarket's dumpster. Days later, a pedestrian walking a dog near the store spotted one of Katz's legs lying on the curb. Police recovered the remains and reported to the press that a grisly killing had occurred, releasing no further details. The body was identified through dental records 2 days after discovery. Joseph Testa and Henry Borelli, who had participated in the abduction, were arrested. They were acquitted at trial in January 1976. The acquittal did not suggest that the crew had made an error in judgment. It suggested the opposite. The woman who had lured Katz admitted her role and testified for the prosecution, and the case still failed to produce a conviction. The lesson was clear. The system DeMeo had been building was resilient enough to withstand direct legal scrutiny, and the method he had employed in Rockaway Beach was improvised. What came after was not. The Gemini Lounge on Flatlands Avenue in Canarsie was, to anyone who walked past it, an unremarkable bar in a neighborhood full of them. There was nothing about its exterior that distinguished it from the surrounding blocks, nothing that would have drawn the attention of a passerby who had no particular reason to look closely. Inside, the picture was more complex. The storeroom held the arsenal. Behind the bar and through a side door was the apartment that Guglielmo occupied full-time as a security measure, his continuous presence ensuring that the building was never unoccupied long enough for investigators to enter unobserved. The apartment adjacent to the Gemini Lounge was known within the crew by a name that conveyed its function: Horror Hotel. Inside it, DeMeo maintained what court records would later describe as a murder toolkit: guns, knives, ice picks, ropes, plastic sheeting, and the instruments necessary for what the crew called the next step. The method that DeMeo developed, and that multiple crew members later described to investigators in comprehensive detail, became known as the Gemini Method, named for the lounge that housed its primary location. The process began with a lure. A target would be brought through the side door of the lounge into the apartment, presented with an invitation that had nothing threatening about it. At that point, a crew member, and according to Frederick Denome, who became a government witness, it was almost always DeMeo himself, would appear carrying a silenced pistol in one hand and a towel in the other. He would shoot the victim in the head and immediately wrap the towel around the wound like a turban, preventing the blood from spreading. A second crew member would then stab the victim in the heart to stop the blood from continuing to pump out of the gunshot wound. By this point, the victim was dead. The body was stripped of clothing and moved to the bathroom, where it remained until the blood had drained or congealed sufficiently. Then it was moved to the main room, placed on plastic sheets that had been laid out in advance, and dismembered. Arms, legs, and head are removed and placed into bags. The bags went into cardboard boxes. The boxes were transported to the Fountain Avenue landfill in the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn, opposite the Starrett City apartment complex on Pennsylvania Avenue. The landfill receives so many tons of garbage daily that the probability of any remains being located was effectively zero. During an early 1980s investigation into the crew, authorities considered excavating sections of the Fountain Avenue landfill to locate remains. The plan was abandoned when investigators concluded the cost and the logistical difficulty made the search unfeasible. The landfill was closed in 1985, capped, and converted to parkland. It remains parkland today. No remains connected to the DeMeo crew were ever recovered there. On at least one occasion, a cabin cruiser owned by Richard Denome was used to dispose of remains at sea when circumstances made other options impractical. The crew's flexibility in adapting to operational constraints was a feature of the method rather than an exception to it. DeMeo had organized his killing operation the way he organized his car theft operation, with defined roles, consistent procedures, and contingency planning for complications. Crew members knew what they were responsible for and executed their functions accordingly. In the fall of 1976, Carlo Gambino died of natural causes, and the organization he had led through 2 decades of expansion passed to Paul Castellano, the head of the family's Brooklyn faction. With Gambino gone, new members could potentially be inducted into the family. Nino Gaggi was elevated to the position of capo regime, taking over the crew that Castellano had previously headed, a promotion that moved Gaggi closer to the family's leadership structure and, by extension, gave DeMeo a more direct line to that structure through his patron. Castellano did not move immediately to open the books. He also made clear that he had reservations about DeMeo specifically. Castellano's preferences ran toward white-collar crime, real estate, construction contracts, the sort of enterprise that generated revenue without the attention that came with street-level violence. DeMeo was everything Castellano's preferred criminal model was not. He was violent, unpredictable, and producing bodies faster than any other crew in the family's history. Gaggi argued repeatedly for DeMeo's induction. Castellano rejected the argument repeatedly. DeMeo, by 1977, was frustrated enough with his unofficial status that he began looking for an opportunity to change Castellano's mind. The opportunity arrived in the form of Mickey Spillane. Spillane led an Irish gang with roots in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan that had been creating delays for the construction of the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, delays that affected a project in which Castellano had a significant financial interest. In May of 1977, Spillane was murdered. His successor, Jimmy Coonan, assumed control of the Irish criminal operation on Manhattan's West Side, and DeMeo moved quickly to arrange an introduction. DeMeo persuaded Gaggi to bring the idea to Castellano. Coonan and his lieutenant Mickey Featherston were called to a meeting with the Gambino boss, and the arrangement that resulted was direct. The Westies, as Coonan's organization was known, would operate as a de facto arm of the Gambino family, sharing 10% of their profits and taking on murder contracts that the family needed handled. In exchange, they received access to the union relationships that Gambino control of the construction industry provided. DeMeo's role in creating that alliance was the argument that finally convinced Castellano to act. In mid-1977, Roy DeMeo was formally inducted into the Gambino crime family. The conditions Castellano attached were the same ones that had always defined the tension between them: no killing without prior approval and no drug dealing. DeMeo left the induction ceremony and returned to Canarsie. His crew continued selling cocaine and cannabis out of the Gemini Lounge. Later in the same year, DeMeo killed a car thief named Jonathan Quinn, suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, and killed Quinn's 19-year-old girlfriend Sherry Golden at the same time. The two bodies were deposited where they would be found as a public warning. No approval had been sought. The car theft ring that DeMeo had been building since his days as a Lucchese associate had, by the late 1970s, become something with no comparable predecessor in the history of New York organized crime. The operation worked with industrial efficiency. Between 4 and 7 vehicles were stolen each night, processed through chop shops that the crew operated, fitted with documentation that the crew forged, and shipped through New Jersey ports to buyers in Kuwait and Puerto Rico. At its peak, the operation was generating approximately $150,000 per week, the equivalent of $7 or $8 million annually, flowing upward through Gaggi to Castellano, and sustaining the organizational tolerance that kept DeMeo's more problematic activities from producing consequences. The FBI designated the operation the Empire Boulevard Operation after the Brooklyn corridor where much of the activity was centered. The name appeared in their files before the crew was fully aware it had attracted federal attention. By the time the FBI's interest had matured into active surveillance, DeMeo had expanded his criminal portfolio in several additional directions. His crew included a member who served as the chief cocaine supplier to Studio 54 during the club's most documented years. The pornography distribution network DeMeo had built continued to generate revenue. He was hijacking delivery trucks from Kennedy Airport through his crew member Edward Grillo, a specialist whose particular skill set DeMeo had recognized and cultivated. Through all of this, Castellano received his payments. The money came from sources Castellano preferred not to examine too closely. The arrangement had an internal logic that required a certain selective blindness on the part of the family's leadership, and for most of the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, that selective blindness was sustained by the consistency of the revenue. Chris Rosenberg had always operated at the edge of what the organization would tolerate, and in the spring of 1979, he stepped past it. Rosenberg had arranged a 12-kilo cocaine deal with a Cuban drug dealer in Florida known as El Negro. During the arrangement, he had identified himself using the name Chris DeMeo, connecting the transaction explicitly to DeMeo's name and to the broader Gambino structure. When the Cubans arrived in New York to complete the deal, Rosenberg murdered them all and took the cocaine. The Cuban killed in the transaction had connections to a Cuban drug cartel, and what followed was the internal crisis that would mark the beginning of the end. On March 17, 1979, Rosenberg killed Charles Padnick, William Serrano, and two other individuals who had brokered the cocaine transaction. The cartel's response was immediate and menacing. 2 days later, on March 19th, a young man named Jamie Padnick arrived in New York asking questions about his father, Charles. The crew killed him before he could direct those questions toward anyone who could cause institutional damage. The fear that settled over the Gemini Lounge in the weeks that followed was of a kind that DeMeo had not experienced before. He had killed many people without consequence because the system he had built was designed to prevent consequences. This was different. A Cuban cartel with reach and resources was looking for the man named Chris DeMeo, and DeMeo's own name was now part of the story. On April 19, 1979, DeMeo shot and killed an 18-year-old door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesman named Dominic Ragucci outside a building in the neighborhood. He had mistaken Ragucci for a Cuban hitman sent to find him. The crew fled to California. Testa and Center disappeared from Brooklyn for weeks. Nino Gaggi issued the order. Paul Castellano concurred. The problem that Rosenberg had created could only be resolved one way, and DeMeo was the person who had to resolve it. On May 11th, 1979, DeMeo lured Rosenberg to the crew's regular meeting place and killed him with a single shot to the head. To satisfy the Cuban cartel's demand that the killing be visible and public, Henry Borelli subsequently sprayed Rosenberg's car with machine gun fire, leaving it and the body where they would be found and reported. The crisis resolved. The men who had created it dead or scattered. But the attention it had drawn did not dissipate. The FBI had been watching Canarsie for long enough to understand that the density of missing people connected to the neighborhood exceeded anything that coincidence could explain, and the Rosenberg episode had added names to the file and given investigators a structure to examine. The Empire Boulevard Operation was the thread they pulled. In the summer of 1980, federal agents raided the warehouse that served as the car theft ring's headquarters in New Jersey. The surveillance that preceded the raid had been close enough to identify crew members unloading vehicles on site. In May of 1981, Henry Borelli and Frederick Dynome were arrested for their roles in the stolen car operation. DeMeo, who was not directly charged at that stage, instructed both men to plead guilty to the charges and accept the legal consequences without providing any additional information to investigators. The intent was to close off further inquiry into the broader operation by satisfying the specific indictment. Borelli and Dynome complied. The calculation was reasonable as far as it went. What DeMeo had not fully accounted for was the state of Dominic Montiglio, Nino Gaggi's nephew, who had been present at enough organizational meetings and had driven enough of Gaggi's tribute payments and DeMeo's loan sharking collections over the years to hold in his memory a comprehensive account of what the crew had done and who had done it. By the late 1970s, Montiglio was dependent on heroin. By the early 1980s, his position as Gaggi's errand man had become untenable. In 1983, he was arrested on extortion charges and made a decision that would cost the organization more than it had anticipated. Montiglio became a government witness. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program and was moved to 12 different locations over the years that followed, given 21 different names, and reinstated into the program 4 times after being removed for violations of its conditions. He testified in 3 federal trials. His account of what had happened inside the Gemini Lounge and adjacent to it at organizational meetings he had attended as Gaggi's representative and in vehicles where crew members had discussed their activities without particular caution constituted a level of documented detail that no prosecutor had ever previously assembled about the DeMeo crew. Frederick Dynome, already under legal pressure from the car theft conviction, received a further shock in February of 1984. His brother Richard Dynome was murdered. Richard's killers were never formally identified, but law enforcement concluded that the remaining crew members were responsible. Frederick Dynome drew the same conclusion and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Vito Arena, another crew member, followed the same path. By early 1984, the FBI's files on the crew's activities had been substantially enriched by testimony from men who had been inside the rooms where those activities were planned and executed. By late 1982, the question was not whether Roy DeMeo would be arrested. The question was whether he would cooperate when he was. Paul Castellano had arrived at the same question through a different line of reasoning, and somewhere in the fall of that year, the calculation that had always protected DeMeo inside the Gambino family reversed itself. Castellano's reasoning was straightforward. The car theft operation had produced a federal investigation that was already generating indictments. DeMeo was the central figure in that investigation. When the charges came, and Castellano believed they were coming, DeMeo would face the kind of accumulated legal pressure that produced cooperation agreements. And if DeMeo cooperated, what he knew about the organization, its leadership, its finances, and its murder operations would constitute a disaster of irreversible proportions. The money DeMeo had generated over the previous decade was significant. It was not significant enough to justify the risk his continued existence now represented. Castellano circulated the contract. What followed was something that those who documented it later described with a note of dark professional respect. Almost no one would take it. Roy DeMeo was the most feared man operating under the Gambino banner, and attempting to kill him, and failing, would produce consequences that could not be undone. John Gotti's refusal was captured on a wiretap through a conversation involving his brother Gene. Gaggi, who was not a man who declined violent work without reason, declined this particular violent work. The contract ultimately went to Nino Gaggi, the man who had recruited DeMeo in 1966, sponsored his induction, and collected his tribute payments for 15 years, and it went to Joey Testa and Anthony Center, the Gemini twins, who had been with DeMeo since the early days of the crew, who had participated in more killings than the federal files would ever fully document, and who had been DeMeo's most reliable instruments for as long as the crew existed. DeMeo knew. The specific channel through which the knowledge reached him is not established in any surviving account, but the behavior in the days before his death was not the behavior of a man who was unaware of his situation. He reportedly considered faking his own death. He went further than consideration in other respects. Before leaving his house for what would be the last time, he left his ring on the dresser. He left his wallet. He left his watch. He wore a leather jacket to the meeting, and underneath the leather jacket he had concealed a shotgun, the preparations of a man who understood he might need to defend himself and was bringing the tools to try. His daughter's birthday party was that day. He did not attend. On January 10th, 1983, Roy DeMeo went to Patrick Testa's body shop in Canarsie, Patrick Testa Motors, Inc., for what was described as a meeting with his men. The Varuna Boat Club parking lot in Canarsie was unremarkable on the morning of January 20th, 1983, until it was not. 10 days had passed since DeMeo went to the meeting. His family had noticed the absence at his daughter's party, and had reached the kind of conclusion that families in that world could not always say aloud. When the Cadillac Coupe de Ville was found in the parking lot, the car that DeMeo had driven to the meeting, the door was closed and the lot was otherwise quiet. Inside the trunk was Roy DeMeo. He had been shot multiple times in the head. The entry wound in his right hand indicated that he had raised it in a defensive reflex as the shots were fired, a final, involuntary gesture that the medical examiner's report would record and that told the story of the last second of his awareness. A chandelier had been placed on top of the body in the trunk, a detail that no source has fully explained and that the historical record preserves as a fact without clear context. Albert DeMeo, Roy's son, identified his father's body. He was, depending on which source you accept, somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. Albert DeMeo later wrote a memoir about his father and the life that followed, published in 2002 under the title For the Sins of My Father. The legal consequences of DeMeo's death rippled outward in directions he would not have predicted, and Castellano would not have welcomed. Castellano was indicted in connection with the car theft ring that DeMeo had operated, a case built on the Empire Boulevard Operation investigation that DeMeo's death had not closed down. Castellano would never stand trial on those charges. On December 16, 1985, he was shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan, a murder ordered by John Gotti that transferred control of the Gambino family to Gotti himself. The boss who had ordered DeMeo's killing to avoid legal exposure died from another kind of organizational calculation less than 3 years later. Nino Gaggi, the man who had brought DeMeo into the Gambino family 19 years earlier, was arrested in 1984. He was convicted of the car theft conspiracy and sentenced to 5 years. Before the murder trial that followed could reach a verdict, Gaggi died of a heart attack at 62. The man who had recruited DeMeo collected his tribute, ordered the killing of Rosenberg on DeMeo's behalf, and then helped plan and execute DeMeo's own murder, died in custody before the full account of those activities could be rendered in a federal courtroom. The government's case rested on men who had been in the rooms, and 3 of them were willing to describe exactly what had happened in those rooms. Dominic Montilio's testimony encompassed organizational meetings, murder planning, tribute collections, and the internal dynamics of a crew that had been operating at the center of Gambino family violence for a decade. He described what he had seen in terms that investigators found sufficiently detailed and consistent to anchor major portions of the prosecution's case. Frederick Denome, whose cooperation had been motivated by his brother's murder and his own legal exposure, provided testimony that complemented Montilio's at crucial points, particularly regarding the specific mechanics of the Gemini Method and the identities of the crew members who had performed its various functions. According to Dinome's account, it was DeMeo himself who almost invariably served as the shooter, the man who appeared with the silenced pistol and the towel and made the first irreversible move. Vito Arena, the third cooperating witness, filled in additional details of the crew's structure and activities. Richard Denome's murder in February of 1984, which investigators attributed to remaining crew members who had identified him as a likely cooperator, became itself a piece of the evidentiary record. It demonstrated the crew's continued operational capacity even after DeMeo's death, and reinforced the prosecution's argument about the organization's systematic approach to silencing potential witnesses. 2 trials followed. The first addressed the car theft conspiracy and its associated killings. The second addressed the murder counts that covered the decade of the crew's full activity. In June of 1989, 7 members of the DeMeo crew were convicted of racketeering charges. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, the Gemini twins who had been with the crew since its earliest days and who had participated in at least 11 documented killings, were each sentenced to life imprisonment plus 20 additional years. Henry Borelli received a life sentence. The other 5 convicted defendants faced terms of more than 20 years. Assistant United States Attorney William Mack, who had led the prosecution, assessed the crew and its record after the sentencing in terms that the historical documentation supports. The Roy DeMeo crew, he said, was the most violent crew ever prosecuted in federal court, and DeMeo had engaged in wholesale murder. The phrase is measured and specific rather than rhetorical, drawn from a decade of documented activity, and it stands as the formal institutional assessment of what the operation had been. The physical locations where the crew had done its work became, in time, something else. The Gemini Lounge on Flatlands Avenue in Canarsie, where the Gemini Method had been executed in the adjacent apartment, and where the planning for hundreds of criminal operations had taken place across more than a decade, is now a church. Its congregation calls it Purpose Life Church. The building still stands. The Fountain Avenue landfill in East New York, where the majority of the crew's victims were deposited in bags inside cardboard boxes, was sealed under a layer of cap material and converted to open green space. It is parkland now, and the ground that holds it has not answered any of the questions that were put to it. Dominic Montilio eventually left the protection program, returned to Brooklyn, and became an artist. He had been in enough rooms to know what the crew had been, and he had lived long enough to tell it to people who wrote it down. What Roy DeMeo built was specific in its dimensions. An operation that murdered between 75 and 200 people over less than a decade, generated millions of dollars annually for one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, and did all of it from a single bar in a single Brooklyn neighborhood, while its central figure drove home to Long Island in the evenings and coached youth sports on weekends. The institutional framework that made it possible, the Gambino family's willingness to absorb DeMeo's costs as long as his revenue exceeded them, was the same framework that ultimately killed him. Castellano needed DeMeo to generate money and needed DeMeo to kill people, and when those two needs produced a liability that the money could no longer offset, the organization applied to DeMeo the same solution had applied to everyone else who had become a problem. The ring, the wallet, and the watch left on the dresser before the final meeting, the concealed shotgun that did not save him, the trunk of the car he drove to Canarsie. The men who built the Gemini Method built it because they believed that without a body there was no crime. What they could not account for was the men who had been in the rooms and who were still alive to describe them. They described enough. The convictions followed, the sentences were imposed, and the locations where the work had been done were converted into a church and a park, as if the land itself had decided to offer a different account of what it was. The trunk is the final image because it is the accurate one. A man who had placed dozens of people into exactly this situation was placed into it himself by the crew members he trusted most, on the orders of the boss whose revenue he had spent 15 years generating. The chandelier placed on top of him does not explain itself. The historical record preserves it as a fact and leaves its meaning to whoever is looking. What remained in Canarsie after all of it was a church where the bar had been, and a parking lot by the water where the car was found, and the question that every story of this kind eventually produces: what, in the end, did any of it build that outlasted the men who built it? The answer the historical record returns is characteristically plain: a parkland over a landfill, a congregation on Flatlands Avenue, a memoir by a son who had to identify his father's body, and a federal prosecutor's assessment, delivered after the verdicts, that the whole enterprise had been wholesale murder from the beginning, which was, by any honest measure, what it was,